Uh, Welcome to this panel discussion where we'll be talking about the fall of ISIS and the end of ideology. I have with me Yalda, who works with the BBC, and she has been tracking the rise and fall of the Islamic State. And Brian, who is the head of public policy for counter-terrorism pushback on Facebook, and more famously the author of the master plan, which tracks the rise of ISIS, the birth of ISIS, and how one organization metamorphosizes into another, and it goes on and on and on. So, and I am Kanchan Gupta. I am a journalist based in the National Capital Region of India. I write on violent extremism, not only radical Islam but also left-wing violent extremism. But I guess today's will be largely about ISIS. Yalda, let's start with you. Do you think that the decline and final fall of ISIS, does this mean the end of ideology or that particular virulent brand of ideology which fueled its rise?
Absolutely not. I mean, the first time I went to Mosul, I was smuggled into Mosul, where I filmed my whole journey on a mobile phone, was at the end of 2012. And at that time, we were being told that there are sleeper cells in the city where various violent extremist groups, they weren't sure if they were aligned with Al-Qaeda or not, and who this group were operating in the area, terrorizing people, taking extortion money. And then, of course, then in June of 2014, we saw this very dark, brutal military take over large swathes of northern Iraq and Syria and declare Mosul the capital of its caliphate. I was recently in Mosul. I've been going back and forth since the war began to try and eliminate the so-called Islamic State from the region. And I was there last year, and I can tell you that they've gone back into the community, many of them, because many of them are sons of Mosul. They're young people who came from within the communities themselves. And actually, if the political dialogue doesn't begin, if we don't attempt to bring in some of these, Sunni tribesmen, Sunni communities in that region who feel very much disenfranchised and affected by the government in Baghdad, then again, I think we will see an ISIS 3.0.
So basically you're talking about the need to include Sunnis back into Iraqi national life. Brian, I often wonder, whenever we talk about violent extremism or radical Islam, we tend to look at West Asia, the rest of the world. Nobody looks at what's happening in Africa. Look at the Boko Haram. It's there, it's rising, its depredations continue. And would you think it's the same ideology that drives them?
Well, I think there is the Islamic State has a consistent ideology that it attempts to project around the world, and a lot of groups in various places have adopted that ideology. Now, depending on the organization, they may actually believe it, and in other cases, they find it useful for their branding. But one of the disturbing things that we've seen with the Islamic State in particular is that a lot of previously established militant organizations have adopted its ideology, have adopted some of its tactics, and in some of cases those people are real diehards, and they're going to continue to pursue the overall goals of the organization long after the group that has held so much territory for a moment there in Syria and Iraq loses the ability to control that territory. But I agree with Yalda very much so when you look at Syria and Iraq, that organization, even in those core areas, isn't gone. It has lost the ability to control with authority a lot of territory. But we've seen that before in the group's history. People forget that what became the Islamic State was previously called the Islamic State of Iraq, which was actually declared in 2006. And it suffered great defeats. It went underground, largely in Mosul. But during that time period, was able to build underground networks, operate as a terrorist organization, and maintain the framework that allowed it to surge back into power when a political vacuum opened up. And what I worry about is that we may make that mistake again, that they can go back underground.
And in fact, the caliphate may be gone, if I can just add
Yeah.
to that, but the ideology remains. And you know that from all your work on social media, that they have such a strong base there now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know...
But often, I'm sorry to interject,
No,
but
of course.
often what happens is that nobody talks of the ideology that drives violent extremism.
Yes.
We always look for quick fix solutions. Now look at what's happening in the Sinai in Egypt,
Yes.
and the rise of violent extremism in that part of the country. 300 people get killed in a mosque bombing. The Egyptian army is actually at war over there in its own territory. We don't get to hear or read about it because of the nature of the Egyptian state. And again I go back, I mean, as you move down Africa, they are feeling the heat, and nobody talks about that either. So nobody is really trying to address the core issue, so to say, of fighting the ideology behind the rise of radical Islamism.
Yeah, well, I think there are a range of efforts in various places to try to push back on the ideology. At Facebook, you know, it's just one piece of that, but we run a variety of programs to empower local communities to develop counter-extremism campaigns. One very large one is called the Peer-to-Peer, the Facebook Global Digital Challenge, which runs in universities around the globe. And what it does is it allows for students to develop campaigns countering extremism as they see it in their local communities. So it's a global program, but it's implemented in a local context. And that program over the last couple of years has had, you know, all of those different campaigns developed by students have reached 200 million people around the world, which is pretty amazing. But I think what's key here is that, you know, CVE programs to push back on ideology, to try to create productive community is really important, but that can't just be a communication strategy. At the end of the day, these terrorist organizations are grounded in their perceptions of the real world, things that are happening offline. So these campaigns that happen online are great. At Facebook, we're certainly committed to doing our part with them, but at the end of the day, what's going to matter even more is how these groups are interacting with the societies in which they operate.
Yeah, but the real world which you mention is often also an imagined world.
Sure.
So then, you know, that creates its own sense of victimhood, which then feeds into radicalization.
Can I just add to that?
No, but what I wanted to ask you really is that he talks about what social media is doing. Do you at times think that maybe mainstream media failed in countering the rise of violent extremism because we were only reporting a story, we were not really going beyond the story?
I don't know if I'd look at blame mainstream media for the rise of ideology and extremism. As Brian was saying, that they, you know, if you look at ISIS now, they were the son of, you know, Al-Qaeda, and there will be a son of ISIS. So, and when we talk about ideology, you know, I've covered extremists in Europe, and we have to understand in various communities in Sweden, for example, where does this ideology come from? Where does, when a young person is second or third generation, you know, Swedish Iraqi or Swedish Jordanian, why do they develop these hardline views? How were they so easily being able to be manipulated or radicalized in a mosque or online? And this all happens because they get pushed out onto the peripheries of society. A lot of them are school dropouts, so by the time that, you know, they're 13 or 14...
But they had all the opportunities. Can you imagine the opportunities they had in Sweden or any other European country?
I'm not justifying why they've become
compared to what they would
hardline.
have in Iraq or
absolutely,
Jordan
but I'm
or
not justifying why they've become hardline. But I'm giving you. It's not just, you know, you have to just look at Islam, for example, as it has a violent streak to it. No, there are many other factors that come into force and play that drive these people to leave their homes, leave their families, and go to a place like Iraq or Syria, which is completely alien to them. You know, and it's a breakdown between the state and the communities and these young people.
Brad, do you think that there's, does it really, I mean, often I've wondered about it. Somehow to me it doesn't make sense. You have a Muslim immigrant in America or Europe who grows up in that country, makes the best use of the opportunities, the resources, and becomes leads a normal life like you and me. And then you have people who have the same opportunities, same access, and yet they go the other way. So does exclude this whole thing, sense of victimhood, a sense of being excluded, does it really hold good?
Well, I think, ideology plays a part, but I think it's really important to understand that as successful as the Islamic State has been, radicalizing people around the world and inspiring them to come to Syria and Iraq, it is a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1.6, 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. Tiny, tiny fraction. And one of the things that we see with those patterns of radicalization globally is that they tend to be lumpy, right? You find a cluster of people that radicalize in one place, a cluster in another place, and sometimes those clumps, those little clusters, are really near each other. It's a neighborhood in Brussels versus another neighborhood in Brussels. And so there's something going on in a very local setting.
And it could be gang violence.
It could be gang violence, right. And what winds up happening is then they're able to connect to this global ideology that is trying to attract those people that are disaffected in that local context, but they're able to explain their local circumstances, that disaffection that they feel as a result of whatever their context in, based on this global ideology. And I think that's the danger. It's both global and extraordinarily local simultaneously. And for there to be a real global pushback against this ideology, we have to recognize that both of those things are happening at the same time.
Can I just also add, though, that if you look at the State Department numbers of the number of young people who went to Syria or Iraq from the United States and compared to the ones who went from Europe, there's huge difference.
Yeah.
There's a very small number going from the United States. Why? It might be 500, for example, was the State Department number, and across Europe it was something like 10,000. Why is there such a difference? Because actually, perhaps the immigrants who have gone to, and their children who have gone to the United States are more aspirational, are able to get better jobs, are able to prosper within the societies, whereas they may not have been able to do in France or Germany or Belgium. So that's where we need to make the distinction. When there are opportunities given and aspirations, you see the numbers were much smaller.
Well, the counter view is that, after all, somebody like Mohammed Atta, who led the 26/11 attack, he was educated in Germany, he was working in Germany, and by all accounts that subsequently came out, he was well integrated into the larger community over there. And yet he went and did something like this. Now, what I mean is that I sometimes feel that we overemphasize this whole thing about getting excluded from the processes of normal societies, and that forces them that way. For instance, I think we had a discussion 2 days ago, last Sunday, and there was some mention that why is it that Muslims from India have not gone in large numbers to fight for ISIS? There are various estimates ranging between 10 and 100.
7 and 100.
So 7 and 100. So
small, really small.
It's really small, but again, we shouldn't really be looking at numbers. We should be looking at the larger impact which even 7 can have in a country of 1 billion.
But there's 130 million Indian Muslims.
No, what I mean is that 7, forget whether they're Muslims or non-Muslims, but 7 terrorists can wreak havoc in a country of 1 billion people. After all, there were only 8 people who were involved in the Bombay attacks. And so numbers don't reflect the actuality of the crime that is committed. But coming back to media, quick comment from you. There is often this allegation that BBC allows political correctness to come in the way. And that sort of ends up mollycoddling the radicalized. How true is it?
Well, I think in a climate where the role of the media is being questioned every day, where we're being accused of being fake news, I think that what the BBC is doing by maintaining impartiality and providing fair and factual news coverage means that we're able to sustain the current climate, rather than taking opinions and sides in this current sort of political heated environment that we're in at the moment. I think it's incredibly important that we continue our role as the reputation that we've always had, to be fair, balanced, impartial. And I think that's more important than kind of getting caught up in the accusations of whether we're too impartial, if you may.
Thank you, Yalda, thank you, Brian, for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.